A while back, Hori announced a Steam-branded controller. Needless to say, that doesn't happen every day, and many folks were disappointed to find out it would be exclusive to Japan. Fortunately, many months later, the unique controllers landed stateside for about the same price as most mid to upper range controllers. As someone who spent way too much money importing one of these controllers from Japan a few months ago, I figured it'd be a good time to give you all the rundown on its quirky features and whether it might be right for y'all's gameplay needs. But first, some caveats. This isn't entirely a new controller design that Hori painstakingly worked with Valve to design. Rather, it's a wireless, Steam-branded variation of the Hori Pad, a mostly wired controller line for Xbox and Switch. On its face, there are some clear differences for Steam-centric navigation, but the similarities are quite obvious. The newer version even has a covered spot where the headphone jack would be on those other controllers. So yeah, if you were looking for some revolutionarily unique controller on the level of the original Steam controller, this isn't going to be for you. However, what is here is an exceptionally quirky, polarizing controller that's going to feel great to use for Steam for the right kind of person. To understand what I mean, look no further than the core design of it all. It's slightly rounder than many other controllers, and the overall layout feels dense, but very spacious at the same time, with a sort of gadget punk sort of vibe. The glossy black section in the center contrasts well with the rest of the shell. Alongside highlighting the stick and D-pad, it shows off minimalist status lights for connectivity, connection mode, turbo, and charging, which all feel more straightforward than the standard multi-purpose lights employed by most other controllers. Plus, alongside the Steam buttons and the white rings around the sticks, it all comes together as something that looks like it could fit in with Valve's hardware design language. That unique feel continues on with the action buttons, which feel a tad more spaced apart than on other controllers. It didn't take me too long to acclimate to the difference, especially given that they're soft to the touch with a nice bit of feedback to them, but the experience feels notably different compared to other controllers in my collection. It's a bit more difficult to hit multiple buttons at once here. Each button lies at the edge of my thumb instead of toward the center. Yet I kinda like it. Each button press feels more purposeful, even if it fights against my muscle memory. The unique experiences continue when jumping over to the sticks. No Hall effect sticks here, instead Hori's included capacitive stick tops, like what's used on the Steam Deck. Just like the Steam Deck, these touch-sensitive tops can be mapped to trigger different modes, button presses, or functions within Steam input, though I imagine most folks would use them to activate the built-in motion controls. When paired with a Windows machine, that feature works seamlessly. Opening a game like Portal 2, which has an official Steam controller layout that loads by default, motion control is automatic and feels fluid as a fine adjustment to my right stick. Meanwhile, games without a pre-established profile only take a moment to set up. While I could have a similar feature triggered all the time with another gyro-enabled controller or tied to a remappable button press, having the quick access to activate it without setup feels great here. I honestly hope more controller manufacturers adopt similar tech in the future. What feels less great is usage with a Steam Deck, or more specifically, SteamOS. While booted into Windows on my Steam Deck, the controller feels great. However, the moment I go back to SteamOS, something feels very wrong. Moving the camera with motion feels choppy, like the frame rate just dipped by 30%. It's likely that a driver is missing somewhere in the connection between devices. But as a Steam-branded controller, it's a bit awkward that it doesn't work with a Steam machine right out of the box. That's especially true given the large overlap between folks who would buy a Steam-branded controller and a Steam-branded handheld. Hopefully, this all gets ironed out over time as more Steam-branded controllers come to the market. For now though, if you pick one of these up, I'd recommend sticking to Windows. Next, let's talk about possibly the most polarizing part of this controller, the triggers. While they may look like standard trigger buttons with a shallow depth, they are far different than just about anything on the market. A switch on the back swaps them between digital and analog modes at will. In digital mode, it acts like a standard digital trigger. Either it's pressed or it's not, and in this mode, it feels perfectly normal with a decent amount of travel for what it offers. I have no real complaints. However, in analog mode, that initial physical pull doesn't actually do anything. The entirety of the input is captured by, essentially, pressure-sensitive pads at the bottom of the trigger's range. Here, the most subtle of squeezes will provide a wide range of input. Unlike most analog triggers, the Hori pad's triggers can actually be used constantly half depressed. That likely sounds odd or counterintuitive at first, but it works quite well. After a bit of practice, it's really easy to use the pressure pads like a very nuanced hair trigger for anyone with a good sense of control over their grip. When used to its fullest, it can either offer exceptionally fast input with very little effort or a surprising amount of detail to the input. With standard analog triggers, there's typically a bit of resistance throughout the pull in order to provide tactile feedback to the user. Here, there's almost none of that. Instead, it's very much a matter of learning the right amount of force I should be applying at any given moment. In a way, it reminds me of the Steam controller's trackpads. It's not the best input method in all scenarios. Due to a decent learning curve, it'll likely turn a lot of people off. Yet, for someone willing to put in the effort, I could see it offering a surprising amount of detailed control in certain scenarios. Luckily, not everything about the controller is so radical. The D-pad felt a bit stiff at first, but is broken in nicely as I've used the controller more. It's not my favorite, but also more than serviceable. Meanwhile, there are two grip buttons around back that feel solid and have a nice contour to them that fit the controller grips. Those who appreciate grip buttons will appreciate these. Meanwhile, around front are two extra buttons situated just below the lower layer of controls. I'm a huge fan of this positioning. For me, stacked grip buttons usually increase the risk of unintended input, and inline buttons up top are decent, but can be a bit hard to hit by touch. Here, they have their own dedicated spot that's easy to reach. It's been perfect for alt-tabbing out of a game, changing control layers, or even just having an extra option for mouse clicks. In fact, while not a Steam controller, this feels like a great controller to use for Steam, for folks who like to tinker. Steam Input automatically recognizes it as a unique product with all its buttons easily remappable. And, like I mentioned with Portal 2 earlier, if a game already has a Steam controller or Steam Deck specific layout, those get automatically applied at launch. During regular use, it's an exceptionally comfortable controller. The contoured grips allow it to sit just right in my hand with no cramps in sight. While potentially polarizing, Hori's decision to focus the controller's weight toward the grips also makes it feel light at first, but very balanced in practice. Everything connects either wired or via Bluetooth, with a USB Bluetooth dongle packed in the box. Seems like a missed opportunity to not splurge for 2.4G support, but I'd be lying if I said I could tell the difference in most scenarios beyond the quicker initial connection. Honestly, if it weren't for the disappointing fact that the Hori pad for Steam doesn't have rumble support, it'd likely sit up there with Stadia controllers as one of my favorite general purpose PC controllers. Though there is one extra hitch weighing it down a bit more. Usage outside Steam. Steam Input's desktop layout does a great job, with physical joystick to mouse support and a single button to toggle into controller mode. However, it's all a bit finicky as to what the controller wants to work with. For example, Game Pass games don't seem to detect the controller unless I bind buttons to keyboard keys, and emulators mostly work fine, but might leave out certain features at specific times. It's been a bit cumbersome to get the analog triggers to work with Dolphin, and the typical option to enable motion input in Cemu is just grayed out. A bit disappointing. Closing out of Steam Input is often a worse experience. The controller seems to get recognized as a D-input device, with the input mapping issues getting just slightly worse. Flicking the X input toggle on the back and using it as a wired controller mostly clears up any of that finickiness. And Game Pass games work perfectly fine, and mapping in emulators feels easier. Unfortunately, Cemu still doesn't recognize motion input by default because X input doesn't support motion. Still disappointing. All of which is to say the HoriPad for Steam is first and foremost a controller to be used with Steam. Outside those boundaries, it still functions, but the experience might be more of a hassle than some other controllers on the market, or take a third-party solution to make work well. Even with that awkwardness, I quite like the HoriPad. Beyond being comfortable to use, its oddities feel like a refreshing contrast to the myriad controllers on the market that try to make their name through just small iterations. The HoriPad feels like a real swing for the fences that's either going to be ruled a home run or a foul depending on the user's perspective. That in itself makes me excited to see what comes in its wake, as well as the potential for more Steam-branded controllers, which attempt to redefine user behavior. But as for whether you should buy one of these controllers for yourself, well, that's going to be a harder question to answer. If you're a controller nerd like me, who's heard me go over all these features while thinking of the perfect use case for them, I think you're going to have a lot of fun using it. However, at $60, it might be out of range as an impulse purchase for those who are less certain of its features. In fact, if you're just looking for any controller to play Steam games, I'd probably direct your $60 more towards the 8BitDo Ultimate line. They're much more conventional controllers with a much broader appeal. As much fun as I've had using the HoriPad for Steam, it does take a bit of effort to use it to its fullest. That's going to be great for certain folks, but a turnoff for many more. And honestly, as the first standalone Steam-branded controller since the Steam controller, that feels about right. Those are my thoughts, though. Now's the time when I ask for yours. Are you interested in picking up a HoriPad for Steam, or have you already picked one up and have thoughts of your own? Let me know down in the comments. As always, if you found this video interesting or informative, go ahead and give it a like to let me know, and then get subscribed for more controller reviews in the future. If you're interested in picking up a HoriPad, I'll have a link to it down in the video description, alongside a link to the 8BitDo Ultimate controller and a few other controller reviews I've done in the past. That's going to be all for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. Until next time, catch you later.